All right, welcome folks. I've just set myself up so I can do my Unit 3 work, and just so you can see what I did here is I made a copy of my Unit 2 folder. I pasted it back in the same folder, so it has all the same contents, both project and the case study folder in there for all of you. I don't have that folder personally, but I do have the project folder in here. In Visual Studio Code, where I'm doing my work, I'm also making sure that I'm going to be working on the correct versions of the files. I don't want to be working on the Unit 2 version at this point. I want to work on the Unit 3 version. Since I assume most of this stuff's going to go into my index page, I'm going to open that one preemptively. But you know what? I can open up my About page too. That's absolutely fine. I am going to bop back over to Blackboard here to pull down the PowerPoint, and so that we can follow along with the author and their topics on this. We do want to make sure that we cover all of those topics. And this recording here will be kind of a regurgitation of what's already there in the course shell with a more modern take on it, I suppose, and the fact that I'll be working on this year's project as opposed to last year's project instead. So, all right, our objectives for this chapter are as follows. So talk about where style sheets came from and why we use them. We will look at using styles in a few different ways. We're not doing anything super fancy at this point, but we are going to start applying those styles and see how they work. We're going to also look at how there's different methods basically for applying styles, whether they're inline, embedded in the document, or added to the entire website. So we're going to learn all that. We're also going to learn some of the terminology and kind of like the pattern of how you do CSS. And then also we'll work a little bit with the CSS validator on W3 schools. Just in case you were wondering, they not only have a validator for HTML, they have a validator for CSS as well. And I hear they're planning to add it for other things, but those are the primary tools. Now, I do have one question in the chat here. How do I download Visual Studio Code? Just to answer that question really quickly, because I think it's pretty pertinent if you want to use the same tool that I'm using, just simply go to your search and type Visual Studio Code. And it's different than Visual Studio. There's actually a Visual Studio, which is the full product from Microsoft, which you could potentially use as well. It's much more complicated though. Visual Studio Code is the lightweight version of the product. And basically you go to this website, which I'm going to drop in the chat right now. And then you can download that for Windows, Mac, or Linux. And it runs on all those platforms, by the way. All right. I can answer more questions about that product as we kind of move forward, but for right now, let's kind of get rolling on the material, and then we can circle back to that if you happen to have a question on it. All right. So we talked last week real briefly towards the end of class, what's possible with CSS? And I brought up this website here, which is a pretty famous website for CSS. And basically what this person who created the site did is he created a basic HTML file, applied his own CSS to the site, so he could take what would look like, something like this, basically it's just ugly and plain, to something that has a little color, pizzazz, and style to it, and it's more pleasing to look at. And what was interesting is he put the challenge out to other coders to take his HTML, basically the same content and structure that he has, and then apply different styles to it. And here were some of the results, right? This is one. Here's another, right? And if you guys remember, we looked at all of these last week. And there's some pretty nifty ones, even ones that have like animations and interactivity. And this is done with CSS, by the way, not with JavaScript or other fancy back-end coding. But it really does show you some of the possibilities where all of these are built on the same code, same HTML, but they're just simply applying styles in a different way to get all the different looks and feels. These are all the same web page. That's kind of the point. All these pages that I'm bringing up are all the same web page. They just have different style sheets applied to them. What I think is really kind of interesting too is style sheets are not new, right? So style sheets are something that we learned basically back in the old print days when we were transitioning to electronic prepress in the print industry, and they had to differentiate basically between the text of a heading and the text of a caption and the text of an article, and how those might be different fonts, different sizes, different styles, different spacing. And basically what they would do is they would create these presets for those things relative to the document that they were printing. And then if you were printing an entire newspaper and you needed an article heading, you just say apply the article heading styles to this piece of text and it would just do it. And that's kind of what we're learning here. So this has existed inside word processors, digital prepress, desktop publishing, and any of those like formal old school techniques still used in all those areas, by the way. But then when they thought of like, how would we do this for web, they came up with the same concept for web. And guess what? We also use these same concepts in programming. So like if you learn how to do Java programming, for example, and you start to learn how to do GUI programs, and then you start to use this technology called Java FX, which also allows for style sheets in almost the exact same format that we use in HTML. So this kind of translates into app building as well, all these same concepts. What is it that we really use this for? I mean, when you think of styles, you think of how something looks typically, but can also affect kind of the behavior of pages. And a good example of that would be that one page that we looked at, or that one version of that CSS Zen Garden where stuff was like moving around, and it's like, man, that's really fancy. How did they do that, right? That is all done with CSS, by the way. The neat thing about CSS is because it's a web technology, it's not really tied to an operating system or a piece of software. It just works for the web. It does have its own unique syntax and language, which is separate from HTML, right? In HTML, we've learned how to use tags to structure our content. With CSS, we will use what we call selectors and style attributes to control things. And within the CSS style sheets and code, we use what we call curly brackets and semicolons and colons to delineate all the content. And you'll see that as we kind of get to the process of actually coding. There's some advantages, of course, for using CSS over using straight HTML. You have significantly more control over what the page looks like, right? When you start to learn basic HTML, you're like, oh, this is it? I mean, that's kind of the reaction you have, right? Because you can see those plain text pages. And then you want to make it look really cool and fancy. It's CSS that gives us that look and feel. The other thing that's important is that when we use CSS correctly, and the correct way, or the preferred way, by the way, is to create a separate file that controls your website, or separate files that control your website, that control the styles. And styles are then separated from the structure of the website. So one thing is a framework, that's HTML. Styles make it look cool. It's like adds the pizzazz to it. Now, the advantage of this ultimately is that you can, and if you think about this, if I have a site that's got hundreds or thousands of pages, I can change one line of CSS code and update all the colors and fonts on the entire website, all 1,000 pages at the same time, without needing to open and edit each individual page. That is huge from a web perspective. So like if you have, like, think about this, if you have a website that's got 1,000 pages, and then your committee or whatever says, hey, we want to switch from this font to that font. It's one line of code in one document, and the whole website updates, right? Powerful, very powerful, makes for much better style management and site control. Style sheets can be done in a number of different ways, right? The preferred method typically is what we call the external style sheet. And that's what, is expected of most professionals, is that's the approach that you use. When we first learn how to apply a style, we will start with inline, attach it directly to a tag, then we'll move those styles to the top of the document, and then eventually we'll move them to an external document. So we'll cover all three of those. And then there's kind of like the fourth oddball one, which is the imported styles, which allows you to bring one style sheet into another. So if you can think about this in principle, you can have an already existing external style sheet, and then you're creating a new one, and I can import the other one in and bring all those styles with. That's a technique too. Not as commonly used, but high-end coders do use this quite a bit. All right. So we'll talk about the differences here, and then we'll start to actually code some of this. So one of the things that we do with inline styles, now inline, just like the tags that we have in HTML that we consider inline, are placed within the body section of the document, the visible part of the page. So I would attach it, like for example, if I have a paragraph and I want to make the font on that red, I go right into the paragraph tag, add a little style attribute, and change the color to red directly within the tag. And that is an immediate approach that you can use. The other approach I could use is I could put a style section in the head section of the document. So like up where you put the title and the meta tag, you create style tags and you put your CSS within it that can also control the contents on the page a little less directly, but on the same page, right? So the styles are in the HTML document and they travel with it. So if I wanted to make the same change on another page, I'd have to do that on the other page, right? Then you switch over to the external approach, which is where we have a separate file. Inside the HTML file, we create a link in the head section that pulls that file in, and then it affects that page and every other page that you're linking, which is kind of cool. Imported, very much similar to the external styles as indicated here, and they do consider it a high-level skill here, so they're not really covering it much. But basically what it allows you to do is either directly into your HTML or directly into your CSS, you can import an already existing style sheet. So what does happen, and I used to do this as a developer myself, is I kind of had like a standard array of CSS tricks that I would use, and I made a file of them, and then I would import them into every project. And if I wanted to make a font red, for example, I would pull in my just red style and it would just do it, right? And I wouldn't have to create new syntax or rewrite the code that I've already written or copy paste it over. I just import that document. Much more common in highly complicated websites, so websites that might have a dozen style sheets on each page, that does happen, by the way. All right, so now we're going to dig into our code engine here and start doing some of this work, but they start by showing you some real basic stuff. Like, this is what a CSS tag looks like, generally speaking. So if I'm writing CSS either in a standalone document or at the top of a page, this is the format I use. The first thing that I declare is the selector. The selector is the thing that says, okay, where are you applying this style? So in this example here, they're applying it to the whole body section of the document. So body, the selector, is a tag, right? So I could use the body tag, I could use the paragraph tag, I could use an H1 tag, etc., right? Then we put in a set of curly brackets. The curly brackets are the shift of the square bracket keys on your keyboard. They're usually just above the apostrophe key or to the right of the letter P on the keyboard. And you'll see them there. And you do have to press shift to trigger those, but those are called curly brackets, as opposed to regular brackets that we use, which are the greater than or less than. Inside the curly brackets, we switch to CSS style syntax, and there we have both properties and values. The property is the thing that we're trying to change. In this case, color actually refers to the color of the font. Then we put in a separator, the colon, right? So just two dots over each other. That's to the right of the letter L with the shift. And then on the other side of the colon is the value for that property. So in this case, if I'm affecting the color of the font, on the right side, I'm declaring which color it is. So in this case, blue. Now, normally, and I say this with all politeness here, when I'm writing this, there's also a closing character that they're not showing here, which is a semicolon. And I'm kind of like rudely or crudely drawing it in, that should be at the end of every style declaration that you make. So color colon blue is a style declaration, and this is the terminator for it, right? The semicolon is the terminator saying, this style's done, give me the next one. So what that implies is inside these curly brackets, we can have more than one style, but when you add more styles, you add the semicolon to keep them separate. Now what happens is the semicolon is not required if there's only one style, or if it's the last style listed. But here's my advice to you as a coder, always include it. You know, that's why I'm drawing it in right now. And I think what would be helpful here is to look at a more practical example. So let's move on to the next slide, and I will pull that up. Okay. So here we have a couple of examples from the author, and we're going to talk about how to deal with colors, but we're going to deal with them in a really basic, practical way to start with. All right. What you're noticing here is an example of a style applied directly to the body part of a page. And I want you to notice how they're kind of putting this together. I am going to keep drawing on the screen here, or highlighting at least. So once again, we have the selector, which means this is going to apply to the body tag and everything inside of it, which, if you think about this, is everything on in the window, right? And so if I say the background dash color is yellow, that means the whole background of the body will become yellow. It's not a great color choice, by the way. Notice the colon to separate us between the property and the actual value, and then the terminating character of the semicolon. Color, this is kind of a weird one, because most of the things, like if I'm putting, let's say, a color on a border, there's a thing called border color. It makes sense. For whatever reason, when they first developed CSS, they didn't think to call font colors. They just called it color, because that was the first thing they decided to color was the font, right? So color, whenever you see that as a standalone word, always applies to the font. And once again, color, colon, blue, will make all of our fonts blue. And then that's the end of the statement. So we put in a semicolon, and then the convention in CSS is to move it down the line to start the next style. Now there's also a way to do colors using old school hexadecimal codes, which sometimes are still the best way to do it. But you'll also notice that up here, you can use color names, provided those color names are in the list of names that are accepted, right? So there's a whole list of them that's published. They went from, I think, 8 standard color names to 16 to 32, and then eventually they made it 256. And now, from what I understand, I think they've expanded it even beyond that. So you can put in like weird colors like soft fuchsia or something like that, and it works. But it's good to look at a color chart. I'm always more comfortable using color coding than I am color names, but it depends on the color. If I'm going for a really basic color like black, white, red, blue, green, something like that, I just call it by name, real frankly, especially with black and white. If it's something very, very particular, like McDonald's red, then I would put in a color code, because there probably is a specific color code for it, and it's probably a little bit different red than primary red. All right. Now, we will be applying these to actual code items, and they're going to start like kind of demonstrating this as they go. But I kind of, rather than talk about a lot of it and then show you, I want to talk about it as we're doing it. And what I'm going to do first is apply some of these styles to inline items directly. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my pages open inside my code editor. So here I am, Unit 3 project, right? These files are open. If you are still using Hex, or excuse me, you're still using Visual Studio Code or Notepad++ or Notepad, you might want to start thinking about a higher level tool at this point because they will start to help you with the CSS. And I have a couple of questions I do want to address. Here, Jaleel, I do see your hand, and I'm not sure if this is the question. Is there some website commonly used to find the hexadecimal color values? And the answer to that is yes, there are many, right? So here, let me start with that. So I usually just cover it as I'm lecturing, but if you actually go to Google and do a Google search for a color picker, Google has one that comes up in the browser, right? We'll talk about how to use this. There are others. And in fact, if you start looking and scrolling down, you'll see there's many color picker apps that work in a browser. There's also apps that are standalone that you can install on your operating system, kind of functionally not necessary. In other situations, your code editor might also help you with that. So if I'm using Notepad++, it doesn't have a color tool built in. If I'm using Dreamweaver, oh my God, I can like totally dig in and name that color any way I want. Visual Studio Code has a somewhat cool but primitive color picker built within, so often that will be enough. But if you really are looking for particular colors, often you will have to go to a website like this and pick one. We're not at the point yet where I will show you how to use this tool, but real soon, by the way. Right now, what I do want to focus on is applying some really basic colors inline to a couple of the elements that we have on our screen already. I am going to go to the index page, and before I do any styles, I want to load up the page clean in my browser from the local file system. I don't want to open it up on Prometheus because then when I make changes, I'm not going to see them right away, right? But here on my local folder, here's my Unit 3, my project, and there's my index file. I'm opening it, and it's opening up in Chrome. So there it is in Chrome. Just so I don't get confused, I'm closing all the other versions of my page in the browser, just so I'm not looking at the wrong one. You guys should probably do the same thing, right? I know this is local once again because it says file here at the beginning, and I can see my path, right? All right. So back over to my coding engine. And I'm going to find a spot now where I can apply a style. And the first spot I see that's probably makes sense is maybe this first paragraph tag that I have here on line 18. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert what we call an inline style in this case. And that is a style directly attached to the tag I want to affect. So in this case, I add a space inside the tag. It has to be on the opening part of the tag, by the way. And then I add the keyword style, a pair of quotes, and then the style I want to declare, which is color. I put in a colon, and then you see what Visual Studio Code does is it actually gives me a list of colors here if I want to add them. Now, I'm going to actually just type one in, and I'm just going to say red, right? I'm going to add a semicolon, and then that's my style declaration. I'm going to do a Control S to save. Now I'm going to switch back over to the browser. That's an Alt tab or Option tab. Quick way back. And I'm going to refresh. Now watch that first paragraph, how it turned red, right? And so that's kind of the power of CSS in the most primitive format possible. And inline is the most primitive format possible. And it applies the style directly to the tag itself within the tag structure. Now, while this works, in a pinch, we really, don't want to do this as a matter of practice ultimately. But for your homework, I will ask for at least one example, and I think the case study does the same thing. But give me one example of an inline style. Right, so that's a real primitive example of what that does. All right. If I want to also change the background color on my page, I could do that too, but we're going to actually save this coming up because I want to look at a couple different things before we start tweaking that stuff. So what kind of stuff are we going to really kind of be CSSing here ultimately? Some of the basic ones that you start with might be on this list. So often we're like, man, that white background is driving me crazy. So you want to change the background color. I don't like the color of that font. Change font color. Hey, I don't like the font, right? So then you'll notice with fonts, we have a whole bunch of stuff. We have font families. Remember, color is really font color, by the way, but we never say that in CSS. We can also change the size, the style of the font, like either bold, italic, or whatever. The weight, which is how bold a font is, you can actually control that. But then we can also control other typographical things too, and that's the main focus of this early CSS stuff in the book, is the typographical aspects of this. So how tall are the lines in between each line? So I can control that. I can also set margins. So margins that might not be exactly what you think they are at this point. We think of them as like to the side of the paper and to the side of the screen, and that's kind of one way. We also want to align our text. Normally our text aligns to the left, but we can also right align it or center align it or justify it so it spreads all the way across. And then we can also decorate our text. And most often when we learn text decorations, it's usually to remove it initially, and then later on you can use it to add it back. And then also things like width, right? So like we will learn how, for example, like on a page, like this page that I created is great and everything, but man, the words go all the way across the screen. That's really hard to read. We might want to take that whole website and narrow up the width, right? So we'll learn how to do that stuff. That's kind of an overview of all the stuff we're doing here. Now, there are references out there, and I'm just kind of putting it out there. This is a little snippet from your textbook about some of the ones that we're about to do, right? When you start to dig into like a proper CSS reference, so if you go to W3 Schools, they actually have a reference section where they list all the possible CSS style. There are hundreds and hundreds of these. All right, so first thing I'm going to tell you, don't freak out to that. That's not something you need to memorize. What you need to memorize is how to look it up, right? I've been doing this a long time, so I know a lot of them by heart, right? But I still end up going to the references and going, is it, bordered color, or is it border shadow color, or is it, et cetera? Sometimes you forget the exact syntax or how, like what things you should put in what order to make it work. And there's no shame in looking it up. How do you know when to look it up? When you can't figure it out, basically. Or if you try something and you get an effect that's completely opposite of what you want or not what you're looking for, then you're in this situation where you do have to deal with it, in whatever situation you're in. So for example, if I'm working with, a layout CSS is different than typographical CSS. Or if I'm working with colors, that's different than working with typography necessarily, even though they overlap. So there's so many different styles out there, including like the ones that we saw that were really fancy, like animations. Yeah, those are CSS styles too, and they take a little bit to learn. So those are considered advanced and not really part of this course, by the way, right? These come later in life, but they are things that you could potentially learn on your own. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have you notice that all the different properties that they pointed out in this slide, they kind of break down and tell you exactly how they work here, including all of how they might be applied, right? And they have different scenarios. So my goal right now is I'm going to code through all these, right? So I'm going to go through this whole table and give you examples of each, but I'm going to show you how first to not apply the CSS directly to a tag. I showed you one example, and I might not show you too many more, by the way. So what I will do back here in the code engine is I'm going to go all the way to the top of my document, and now I'm going to focus on the head section. Remember, this is the non-visible part of the page, and I'm going to add to it a style tag. There's style, closing it. So I have an open and closed style section. And now as I start to create CSS, it's going to go in between these style tags. This format for styling is called embedded or in page or local. It's attached to the file because it's inside the HTML file. This does work, by the way, but it's still not considered the best way. Eventually, what we will do is take the styles that we generate here and put them in an external file, but that's coming. Let's start by doing some basic stuff here first. So within the style section, let's try one of the basics that they recommended. And they started out by selecting the body. So this is called a selector now. And then I put in my curly brackets and I press enter. And I want you to notice what Visual Studio does automatically, right? The first thing it does is it leaves the one curly bracket on the top line with the selector, and then there's a style that goes inside there, and then it moves the closing curly bracket back out to the margin and down the line. That's kind of the standard format, and then they want you to type your styles where the cursor is. People do ask me, can I just type it all in one line? Yes, you can, and some coders actually do that, by the way, just to make it more efficient. I do like following the format of the standard layout because it's easier to read for us, the humans creating it. Although, once again, it could all be on one line if you wanted it to. Right. So inside, now we're going to come up with, color we already did on that one tag, but let's do it again. But this time, let's choose the color blue. And I want you to think about this. This is going to apply to everything inside the body tag. Right? Well, this first paragraph, I told it to be red. This one, I told it to be blue. And I do want you to notice here, in Visual Studio Code adds a little color icon here, and I can hover over it, and there's your color picker, by the way, inside the product. If you're using Notepad or Notepad++ or some of the other tools, they won't have that feature. It'll just have the word, right? So if you like the convenience of the color picker, use Visual Studio Code, use Dreamweaver, use brackets, etc. All right, I'm saving this back to the browser, and now we refresh. Now watch what happens. Everything is blue.
Except that line.
Except that, two lines, which is actually one paragraph, because this was already declared as a style red, and this is part of what we call the cascade now. And this way you probably won't wrap your head around this immediately. But when a style tag is applied directly to a tag, that supersedes a style at the top of the document, which supersedes the style in an external file. That's what we call the cascade. So the more locally specific it is, the more precedence it takes in the output. So because the tag had red already added to it, that sits higher in the cascade. It's more specific. So it sits higher in the cascade, so that takes precedence over everything being blue. All right, let's try another style. This one's also going to go on the body, and this time I'm going to say background color. And you see Visual Studio's auto-filling for me, so I'm just taking it. It's also giving me an option of colors, and I'm just going to show you. I could choose one of these, and there's a lot. What would look good as a background color? I'm not really sure, but probably not something that's too strong in color. Let's just go with a light gray for now. I'm going to save this, back over to the browser and refresh and watch the page, and you see how the background changed. All right. Okay, aside from the fact that it looks absolutely hideous, right? This is not maybe the look you're going for, but this is just kind of feeling how the tools work, right? So in this case, I applied to background color for the body, which is the whole visible part of the page, the background color of the light gray. I also applied a font color of blue, and then on the paragraph specifically, I applied an inline color of red. So those are the styles we're seeing on the screen. Now, what if, instead of putting a specific color here, I also applied a specific color for paragraphs up here. So I'm using P, the paragraph selector, and then I use color, which we know is the font color. And I think green is a better font color. Not really, but for sake of demonstration, right? And I notice I put in the semicolon at the end, even though it's not required. Saving the work, back to the browser, and once again, refresh. And then notice, okay, well, I did have one paragraph that came up green. Well, two paragraphs that came up green. Why didn't this one turn green? Well, that's a block quote, right? This is a div. These are UL and an OL. This is a definition list. They're taking the body color, which affects the whole page, but this paragraph, and really truly, this paragraph, all are receiving green. It's just that the top one is overriding it with the red that's in line. But it allows me to control multiple objects of the same type simultaneously with one command. I'm not saying, once again, that these are good stylistic choices. I'm just showing you how it works, right? And in fact, what I will do is, as I kind of keep moving forward, I'm going to start adjusting these to where I do start thinking it's looking pretty good. But for right now, we're experimenting. So we're learning that we can apply different selectors. We're applying them directly to HTML tags. We're choosing a property and then a value, separating them with semicolons, encapsulating it all in curly braces. Hopefully you guys are all good so far. All right. Now I'm going to start looking at that chart a little bit and start to apply some of these to our page. And I think I'm doing a little combination here of looking ahead. So I'm going to come back and hit on all of these styles, but I kind of want to follow through a little bit on the color choice thing right now. What's kind of fascinating about colors on a web page is that colors originally used to only be declared through what we called hexadecimal numbers. Now, I don't want to really go into this whole discussion about what that means, but basically, hexadecimal numbers are a human being's way of interacting with the computer's base 2 number system, which is binary, right? In a little more friendly format that's closer to base 2. It's still not quite base 2, but suffice it to say, hexadecimal is a base 16 number system. And what I'm hoping to find here is like some really quick little link. Of course, here's my, this is great. This is my generative AI Google response that found this image, which actually is very helpful. But really what we're doing is we're comparing number systems. So the number system that we know as human beings is 0 through 10, right? That's base 10. But now we're starting to talk about base 16. So how do you do that with hexadecimal? Well, the first thing is you use the same numbers for 0 through 9. And then when you get to 10, where the numbers start to repeat, we can't do that here. So we start to use letters instead. So 10 is A, 11 is B, D is 13, or excuse me, A is 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, 15 being the biggest number. So F is the largest number in the hexadecimal number system. It's not really a number, it's a letter, but that's how we do hex, by the way. So when you look at hexadecimal codes for the screen, the valid values for any digit are 0 through F, right? Which is 0 through 15, technically. Those all do correlate to binary number values. So if you look at these, right, these are the binary number equivalents. And once again, if you were doing really formalized computer science study, they would hammer you on this stuff. They would make you do binary math and hexadecimal math and convert numbers and all sorts of really goofy stuff to make sure that you know it backwards and forwards. My practical thought on it is you'll figure it out when you need it. When you need the hex code, you'll go to a color picker and pull the hex code. Pretty simple, right? But the hex code is still considered the primary coloring mechanism for HTML and CSS. So interestingly, when we start to break down those hex values into colors, the way that we arrange colors on a screen is screen colors are generated by propagating red, green, and blue. So your screen, if you could zoom in far enough and look at one single pixel, that pixel is allowed to basically project those three colors in various strengths. That's all that pixel can do. Which color it ends up being is how strong we push red, how strong we push green, and how strong we push blue. And the hex numbers, by the way, go in pairs. This is red, this is green, and this is blue. And I can't really type that. I'll try to draw it with the pen. So red, green. Oof, that was bad. So this is, I'm trying to do this with the mouse. Not pretty, by the way, in blue. So red, right? First two digits, green, the second two digits, blue, the third two digits. And you'll notice in this demo they have here, when the first two digits are maxed out, you have red and the others are nothing. When the middle two are maxed out, you have straight green. When you have the last two maxed out, you have blue. Black is the absence of all color on screen.
Just like light.
Just like light. Well, actually, it's the reverse. Is it? Yeah. I'm having Rolf think about it. No, he's right. It is just like light. So we have the absence of light, so it's black, right? If all of them are maxed out, we have white. If all of them are equivalent, we have some shade of gray. That's kind of interesting, ranging from black to white. If you start mixing these values, this is where it gets interesting. That's what the next page is about. You start mixing these values, and you'll notice, and this is just a little snip from a hexadecimal table, and somewhere in the back of your book, I think the author still puts this stuff in. And frankly, when we were young and we were learning this stuff, and they would print tables in the backs of books, and then of course, if the colors were printed accurately, you could kind of choose your color. They didn't have color picker websites or tools built into software. You would just experiment with it until you figure it out. Now all the tools are there. But interestingly, when you start to look at individual colors, you'll notice that the values inside here start to change, and each particular color has its own hex code, right? Not to complicate things too much, but there used to be, for a short period of time, a difference between what we call web colors and computer colors. Now this is even weirder. And for a while, we were capped at 216 colors instead of 256 colors like we have today, at least through hex, right? The truth is, when you start to combine all the hex codes completely, you actually end up with a color palette of 64 million colors, roughly. That would be the complete color palette on a computer screen. I will note, 64 million is still not what we have in nature, which is infinite color detail. Because, 64 million is a lot, but it's not everything. Right, so it's just some of those are still approximation, but you should be able to get really close to the color you want using those 64 million colors. Probably hit it. If you really want to work on that and learn about this, go for it. I'd say this is kind of an antiquated and dead concept. At this point, the colors that we see on our screens, as long as you have a relatively modern computer with a good sort of decent graphics card, you will get all the colors. You have to have kind of an older machine to not, by the way. One thing I will note, by the way, is when you are picking colors, there are differences in computer monitors. And I don't mean to startle you with this, but if you use an external monitor, and Jonathan, I'm kind of looking at you because I know that like right now you're on an external. Is your external monitor also a Mac monitor?
No, it is not.
Is it probably a PC monitor?
Yeah, it's an LG.
Okay. And I have the same thing going on at home. So I have like an MSI gaming monitor, and
Mhm.
I have either my Mac or my PC. And the internal monitors on those machines, both my Mac and my PC, I know are color accurate. You know why? Because I calibrated them. Right. And so here's another thing. Your monitors can be calibrated. You have to do that usually with your graphics software. If you have a Mac, and I'm just throwing this out there, if you have a modern Mac, it comes pre-color calibrated, by the way. So Mac colors are accurate right out of the box. Here's the good news. Most modern PCs that have decent graphic cards also are color accurate. When we start to project to external monitors, though, you will notice, like if I create like a thing that, like a big thing that's like blue or green usually, or in those color ranges, and I straddle it between the two monitors, sometimes you will see a color difference because some of our external monitors are still working off of primitive color palettes. So even though we're feeding the right colors to it, it's not displaying them correctly. So this is something to really be concerned about in certain color ranges. And when you do spot it, it's really striking. I can't really demonstrate it here in class because I can't really project two monitors out to Zoom. But I do know that the monitor I have here on my desk, which is an HP L2245WG, which is a nice enough monitor for business purposes, it's not a nice monitor for graphics or art purposes. It's fine for Word and Excel. It's not fine for editing video. You know what I mean? And the colors are not as accurate on it as they are on my PC screen. Right, so this is a consideration. All right, so where the heck do you go to choose colors then? Well, I just gave you the one, right? Here's the one. That is, and this is the one I most often go to these days, is I use the color picker inside of Google, right? If you're using Google Chrome and your default search engine is Chrome, it will just do it. So there's a bunch of other websites, and I will bring those up in just a moment. There's some that are better than others, by the way, but for a quick color pick, this is my go-to, and I strongly recommend it. If you have another web-based one, hey, go for it. But basically the way the tool works is this panel shows what color you've picked. Here you click on various parts of the screen until you get, the shade that you want. But down here is like where on the color chart you're choosing the color from. So if I wanted an indigo or something, I might come to like maybe around here somewhere, and then I would click around the screen until I got just the right shade of purple. That's a nice purple right there. I'm kind of partial to purples, especially when they're kind of blue leaning, right? And then you'll notice once I have it selected, down here, it shows me the hex code. And you can highlight it and copy. They have a little copy panel. But here's the other secret sauce, is there's other color formats too. Some are supported, by the way, by web browsers, and some are not. Generally speaking, hex, RGB, HSL, and HSV all work on screen. CMYK is really designed for print, where they concoct colors in a different way. In the print world, it's subtractive color. In the display world, it's additive color. Right? Kind of a whole field of study in itself. But if you wanted to take this color and print it on like a cardboard box or something, that's the code you would use. If I'm putting it on screen, it's hex, right? Or RGB. And I will tell you that RGB is quickly becoming the new standard and preferred by a lot of coders. And here's the why. With hex, these numbers, right, are, so 21 is blue or red, 0F is green, 4D is blue. You convert those hex numbers to regular numbers, and they're 33, 15, and 77. So that's why RGB, I think, is a little bit easier. Most of the good modern coding tools, when you pick from their color picker, will automatically switch it to RGB unless you put in a hex code. It is still handy to use hex codes though. So for example, I could take this hex code, bring it over to Visual Studio Code, drop it in my, my paragraph color here, right? Notice the pound sign in front of it is required to tell it that it's hex, by the way. It does find it on the panel, right? There it is, same purple. And now when I save and I go back and refresh wherever that page is here, watch all the fonts change to purple. And that would be just in the paragraphs, right? Those are the only two places where you see it. Okay, so that's one way that you pick colors. These other tools are pointing out, well, you know what? Click on them and go check them out. But I'm going to show you the one that I like the best overall, and it's basically the Adobe one, but that link I think has changed. And I think what you do is you type Adobe color picker, and then it'll just take you. Okay, so it's color.adobe.com. And you do not have to subscribe to Adobe to have access to this tool. This is a free tool, by the way. But I'm going to argue it's maybe the most powerful one. So what's fascinating about this color picking tool, and you can tell right away, it's a lot more complicated. It's got a lot more controls and stuff. But the long and short of it really is, you come to this color wheel and you kind of take this center circle and you just move it around until the center box basically gets that color that you want. And you can see I'm kind of shooting for the same sort of color roughly, right? Or maybe this time I'll go for kind of like a fire red or something like that, or maybe an aqua blue is kind of cool. That's kind of a nice color right there. And you notice I can move around the circle in all different ways, but it's the center circle here that I'm controlling. And as I change it, you'll notice the hex code below that box is changing. And once again, I can copy it. But then they also have RGB numbers here, right? And opacity numbers as well, which is how transparent it is. And then if you want, you can switch to these other formats. I'm leaving myself in RGB because that's default for screen. Since as web developers, we develop for screen, that's our primary concern. Now here's what's kind of neat about this tool. So just take it a little farther. I did find the color I wanted, and I could copy that hex code, drop it into my page. This has got some other features that kind of make it kind of blow away though in my mind. And that is, what if I wanted the exact color that's here in this slide on that font? I can click my eyedropper tool and I can come up here and notice I can do like a pixel perfect grab of that color, and then it pulls up that color exactly inside here. So that's one positive, right? The other one is okay, well, I'm working with this color, and you know what? And a lot of web people say this, they're like, I'm not an artist, right? People will say, I'm just a tech, I'm just a geek, I don't know what colors look good together. Or heck, you might even be colorblind, right? So they have these settings here on the side that allow you to choose colors that work based on certain criteria. So analogous means that they're similar colors. So you can see these are all kind of similar colors, and they, you know what, they kind of look nice together, right? You guys can admit that maybe. Or if I want all the colors to be from the same hue, so this is like if you went to like the paint store and picked up paint swatches, and you grab this like light blue one and then all of these around, it's kind of like a paint swatch. These are the monochrome. So they're all really the same color, just different intensities. It's kind of interesting, right? Different light values and stuff. Or you can split it on the color wheel, right? And you can have colors that are considered triad colors, or from mathematically the other 2 points on the color wheel. And this is really kind of what's fascinating about color, you guys, right? Even though it's something we see and we perceive artistically, it is all mathematically derived because it's generated by light, which is mathematically measurable and therefore convertible to numbers. And therefore we can figure out which colors work together just by doing math, right? And so you put it on the color wheel and you find it, right? So if you were an art major, you would learn about the color wheel big time. Maybe you guys learned about it in school a little bit. But notice I can then switch to complementary. Complementary colors are on the opposite side of the color wheel, or split complementary, or double split complementary. Well, that's weird, right? Or maybe you do a square pattern. Those kind of work too, right? But you can see it's got different ways to basically show you colors that work together based on the color that you chose. So if I chose this blue from the slide, these other colors might work well with it as accent colors or highlight colors. The other thing that you'll also find as a web person is sometimes when you choose like a primary color in particular, like red or something, that sometimes straight primary colors are really, really hard on the eyes. And sometimes it works better if you soften those colors by pulling them in towards the middle a little bit, and it makes them a little less intense on the screen and therefore a little easier to look at. Black and white are usually fine in their native format. Red, green, blue though, oh my God, those can hurt your eyes. They really can on a screen. And you will see that as I'm demonstrating the basic colors, and it's like, man, Ty, that doesn't look good. You are correct, it doesn't, it's too intense, right? And then sometimes you'll also notice if you take one really intense color and put it right next to another really intense color, both of them look horrible together and making it even worse, right? And you know what? It takes a little bit of time. This is kind of neat though, because you can actually save the colors that you get here, and then you can take note of all the hex codes or RGB values or whatever and store them. And like I said, when you work with certain companies or logos or whatever, sometimes they have very, very specific colors they're using, and you want to imitate those. Please go ahead and experiment with all these links here, because that's not the only website that does that. But it is notable to say also that what colors you put on a website is important too, because some people can't see them. And I think I already gave the example in class where Jerry Richter, the guy that comes in here every week and gives us a one-liner, he's one of our instructors and he's colorblind. And so like if I put something up on the screen, I go, Jerry, click on the red one. He goes, it might be this one, but I'm not really sure. Can you tell me which one the red one is? Right? And guys, and I always say this to the males in the room, because as men get older, we tend to become colorblind. You don't even realize that it's happening to you until you go to the DMV and they put up one of those things to test your vision, and you can't, read the number correctly, and then they're like, you better go get some glasses before you can drive. But knowing that, you can work your way around it. There's kind of things, but there are also websites that allow you to check to see if your colors are okay. It is really important when you put stuff on a screen that there's enough contrast between the letters and the background that you can read the words. Have you ever gone to like a website where they have a black background and then the text is like really dark gray and then you can't really read it? Or it's like a really bright red background and then like a bright orange font, like hurts your eyes. And some people, real frankly, can't even see it, can't even see the difference of it. So when you're building websites, know your audience. Sometimes it's not appropriate to use any old color anywhere. It's not. All right. So we started by doing this. So we went ahead and we did an inline color, and we did it with a regular color name. And now that we know a little bit about hex, I'm going to go back and alter that code, because I know from all this lecturing on hex code that if I type # FF, and you can do it upper or lowercase, by the way, it doesn't matter. I'll do lowercase, it seems like this tool prefers it, and then do all zeros. So the first two represent red, FF is full tilt, zeros are all the way off, so green and blue are all the way off. When I save this and go back and look, that paragraph will stay the same color. But let's go change that hex code now, right? Let's change that. So instead of it being FF in 4 zeros, let's go 00 FF 00, which makes it green. And you see how like Visual Studio Code made it green right away. Let's go back to the web page and watch those paragraphs change from red to green. And here's a great example of how a true green on the screen is really hard to read. I don't know if you guys are, like on my screen, it's like a fluorescent green. It's not like a forest green, like Green Bay Packer green or something. This is like, bright shorts from the 80s green, you know. It's literally fluorescent, and it like hurts my eyes to look at it on my screen. I can't really read the words. And that might be a sign of my age. Maybe you guys can read it. My general assumption on something like this is this looks horrible. I hope you agree, right? If you think that this looks good somehow, there's a lack of contrast here. It's very, very hard to read. So contrast really becomes important. And maybe one way to fix this is maybe if I mixed in a little blue, so I'm adding that, made it maybe a little better. No, not much, right? And really the truth is maybe I need to soften this a little bit. And you see how the colors are starting to get darker when I move away from the FF. And now I actually have a color I can read. See the big difference, right? This is way more readable than what I had before. And you got to tinker with it, folks, to get that color right. But let's say you wanted a dark green. We would just leave it all in the green range like this. Save it. And then here's kind of like a dark green. And it's only like halfway up the strength scale. So it takes a little bit of playing until you get the right colors. So don't just go with the first choice, generally speaking. All right, let's go on back now. And now that we've played with this a little bit, we've seen the inline styles applied, and that's all well and good. But you know what? They kind of have a little plan here. And I don't know if you guys are picking up on this plan, but they're actually kind of thinking about styling their page a little bit. But I'm not going to do this on the H1 tag. Ultimately, I'm going to demonstrate it there, and then we'll move it away from there when we go to embedded. So I do have an H1 up here in my header, notice, right? So I'm going to add my style tag. Then I'm going to go ahead and well, I want a different color for my font. Okay, so let's do a color. I'm going to use the color palette here. Let's go with that, I don't know. Crimson sounds epic. No, well, okay, dark red. Let's go dark red. And then I also want a background color too. So yeah, I can do both in the inline style. And I want something that's going to work well with my dark red. Maybe my first inclination is let's try black, right? So I'm putting black in, I'm saving, and now we're going to go back and look. And I know from experience what this is going to look like, and it's not going to look great. Right? So there it is. But it shows you really a couple of interesting things. First of all, one dark color on top of another dark color, even if they are different colors, is not necessarily very readable. Now you might dig this. You might go, man, that's exactly the look I was going for my gaming website. Okay, maybe, okay. But I'm going to tell you that I have a hard time reading that. And the other takeaway here is when I put the background on the H1, did it surprise you that that box went all the way across the screen? Maybe. But it shows you that H1 is what we call a block level tag and occupies the whole width of the screen, or in this case, the whole width of the container, really, that's holding it. The body fills the whole screen. H1 therefore fills the whole body width all the way across the screen. So even though those words end here, the box that contains them goes all the way across the screen. Now, I could see, and I'm just kind of putting this out there, that this might create kind of a cool looking header sort of, if I chose maybe either a different background color or a different font. What I am going to do is I'm going to lighten up that red. So I'm going to choose the color picker here if I can get it to come up. And instead of being all the way over here, I'm going to make that red a little bit lighter so it looks better over the black. And then I want you to notice what happened here inside of Visual Studio Code. When I used the color picker, it flipped me over to RGB mode. And now you can see the syntax for RGB. So it's basically RGB parentheses, number, comma, number, comma, number. Now we'll talk about this some more, but this is equivalent to a hex code. okay? So this is a little bit brighter red. I think it's gonna work better, so I'm doing Control S to save, and then I'm flipping back over and watch the top of the screen there. You see how that got a little brighter? And because it's a little brighter, the contrast is a little stronger and therefore easier to read. Right. Always be really careful when you're using, especially dark colored backgrounds, like what works well. Why does black text work well on top of white? High contrast. The other thing that would work really well is white letters on top of black. That would be high contrast. But if not, you need to kind of move your colors into the brightest range possible while maintaining their color integrity to see the contrast enough to read it. All right. Now I could also soften the background color a little bit, but you guys can mess with that all you want. I'm just kind of showing you, once again, inline styles and then multiple styles applied here. All right. So that's a demonstration of working with inline styles attached directly to the tag with the style tag. All right. Where we're going to go next is embedded styles, but we're going to take a break before we hit this. So 5-minute break, folks. All right, just to kind of recap a little bit here, we just did this inline style with the H1, and we kind of didn't do exactly this, but we mimicked it. And we already started playing with this a little bit, which is the embedded style sheet. So if you recall, back in our coding engine, we went up to the top part, the head part of our document, the non-visible part of the page. We added style tags, and then we started experimenting, applying styles first to the body and then to all the paragraphs. Well, since I created this style here in line with the H1, I really don't want it there. It's not really the best place to put styles, by the way. I'm going to instead create an H1 style here with curly brackets, and then I'm going to come down here to the inline style and grab everything inside the double quotes, but not the double quotes, right? So I'm going to cut that part out. There's the cut, and then the paste. And then these are two different styles, and normally we do two different styles. We put them each on their own line. Now, back here in the H1 tag, I am going to remove the style attribute, put it back to a normal H1, and then I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to show you that it updated just fine because there's no change. Well, can I trust that? Well, I can right-click View Source, and I can look here, and I can see that that style traveled to the page, right? And I think that's pretty important, right? If you're not sure. Of course, another way where you could test it is you could take like one of the colors and make it a little bit lighter yet, like the title, and maybe the background color, maybe it could be a little grayer, or maybe not, maybe a little, I don't know, just a little grayer, not much. All right, and then I can save it, and then you can take a look at the page, watch the H1 at the top up here. Here's the refresh, and see how it changed, right? That just proves that it's working in that spot. Now, why is this important? Because when I put my styles at the top of the page, if I have more than one of the objects listed here, like if I have multiple paragraphs, which I do, I change all of them all at once with one line of code. If I put the H1 here, same thing, right? So if I had multiple H1s, those would all change with the changing of this. All right, that's called an embedded style sheet. It is better in principle, at least, than the ones attached directly to the tag. Right, so good to practice with that. But ultimately, when it comes right down to it, when we do embedded style sheets, you know, and they give some examples here of stuff they're doing, they're not necessarily the optimal way to do it. Right? There's a better way. And the better way really is to start working externally. And that's kind of where this chapter is leading. If you're not feeling that, right? Because ultimately that's really where I want you to do your work, is to do all your work in the external CSS file. But I do need to show you the other two approaches because they are important even in modern coding. So the one question I will get from people is like, well, hey, if it's better to do an external style sheet, why do we learn to do inline at all? right? What's the point? Well, the point is sometimes you're working in systems, and a content management system is a really good example of this, where you don't have control of the CSS file, but you do have control of the content of an HTML page. And if you wanted to override some ugly style that's being forced onto your content, you could do an inline style to override it, or an embedded style to override it. And therefore kind of like hotwire a content management system. All right, let's start playing with some of the font related ones now. And I think these are kind of interesting because as we kind of start digging through these, all of them become important. Remember, the main focus for CSS, at least in this chapter, is more on typography. And then in later chapters, we start to switch to other components of styling. So the four basic ones, aside from color, remember color is font color, are these here that you see on the screen. And font weight is how bold your font is. Font style is the text italic mostly, right? You can do other stuff with it too. Size, well, I think that's a pretty easy one. And then font family is actually which font you're choosing, which is kind of strange to call it a family rather than just call it font, right? I mean, when you think about that, because you think about like a document, you change your font, not the font family. But there's a reason we have a family of fonts in HTML, by the way. The first thing that we look at ultimately is font size here in the PowerPoints. And in the font size area, you know, I think there's some really important little pieces or nuggets of information here on this slide, where this slide is actually a really kind of interesting reference. Because it's very mathematical. But typically when we're working on a screen in a web browser, when we do not declare the size of the font, like my page here is an example. When I look at a regular paragraph, a regular text on the page, the regular size font for a web browser is 16 pixel, PX, right? As opposed to points, which we use in a word processor. 16 pixel font is considered the normal font size in a browser if you do not change it. So if you don't declare the size, it's 16 pixel font for a normal paragraph. The other normal is Times New Roman. What this chart attempts to show us is we actually have at least 5 different sizing systems that we can use for HTML. And some of them are recommended, and some of them should probably be avoided like the plague, right? And so one of them we already played with, and if you guys remember when we first did that HTML basics thing, we did a small. So here it is on the chart, and a small is basically one click smaller than the normal 16 pixel or medium font. So you notice the medium font is what's considered normal. So if we say in HTML medium, it just makes it the normal size, which is 16 pixels, right? And that's actual pixels on the screen. So this is important too. How do we measure that? Well, it will vary. Like on one screen, it will look smaller. Like on my screen, it will look smaller than yours if I have a higher resolution. If you have a super high resolution, sometimes those fonts are scaled, by the way. But in a normal screen, 16 pixels, how does that compare to points? That would be 12 points in like a Word document. But a PT, the point measurement, is relative to how many characters per inch using a certain font in a printed document, not relevant to a screen, by the way. So then the question becomes, why do we have that available? Because you can design style sheets for print documents too. And in some cases, you could use points on pages, not recommended, but it does work. But you have to do a conversion with it. And you see how the conversions are not necessarily uniform, is a polite way to say it. Okay, so another thing that happens too when we're working with fonts on a computer screen, the normal pattern that we typically do is we'll declare a base size for our font and then scale our other fonts relative to it. So 2 scaling mechanisms that we use would be the M's or the percentages. I tend to be more comfortable with percentages, but I will have you notice that if you look at 1M, that's 100%. If you look at 1.15M, that doesn't make sense. That should really be 110%. 1.5 is 150, 2M is 200%. So there's a mathematical relationship here between those. That does not necessarily correlate to the point system. It should, but it does correlate to the pixels. So if you start doing math on it, but then again, you can't declare a half font. So really like 13 pixels should be 12 and a half. You know, it's kind of like, gets weird, right? But generally, if we pick a standard font size for our whole document, then we can scale it either with percentages or M's. And so you will see that a lot in modern programming. Let's play with the font sizes a little bit before we move on to the next slide. So if the default font size is 16 pixel, let's do an experiment. Up in the body section here, I'm going to say font size, and I'm going to say 16px. And notice the px touches the 16. If it doesn't work, by the way. Put in a semicolon. Now, when I save this and go back to the browser, you will notice no change because it's already that size. But as I often do, and I think this is pretty common when I do web work, is I sometimes bop up the default font size like a couple numbers or 3-4 numbers, depending on the site. And I'm very commonly lately have been using 18 as my baseline because I think people are getting bigger screens and they like stuff that's easier to read. So I'm doing Control S. So now watch what happens to the page when I refresh. Did you notice how it got bigger, right? So the default font size then for the whole page now has become 18, or excuse me, everything within the body section of the page has become 18. It's a little bigger, right? Just a little bit bigger. All right. Now, if I wanted to change the font size of my H1 and make it, you know, humongous, I can do the same thing. I could, for example, say 24 pixels, or I choose a really large number, like 64 pixels. That's a really large number. I'm saving it. Watch as I go back. Watch the H1 at the top, the one with the black background, and watch how it got really big. Okay, this might be good. This might be bad. I'm not judging. I'm just showing, right? Now, that sizing, if I'm applying it to a paragraph, now, since I've declared a base font size for the body, if I want to adjust my paragraph font size downward or upward, I could then say font size and issue a percentage. So for example, I could say at 125% of normal. So watch what happens here. It got that much bigger. It got 25% bigger than the bigger size I already declared, right? And that's in a percentage. If I wanted to change it via M's, I could say 1.25 M, which is basically a percentage, by the way. Save. And so this will not change it at all. No change, right? If I wanted to make it, I want to be really persnickety about this and make it 1.21 M. You know, like you're really getting like particular. And wait, we got to save. Watch. Slightly smaller, right? Maybe imperceptibly so, but it's slightly smaller. So that becomes a relative percentage. Caution with that one, but what is considered a good practice on web pages, and I'm just putting it out there, is that you set one base font size and a specific pixel amount, and then you make adjustments to it through M's or percentages. Right? If you're not happy with that, you can always switch this to a very specific pixel size if you wish, not a problem. All right, let's now address this concept of font families. And first, we got to talk about the 5 basic categories of fonts that are the ones that you see listed here on the left side of the table. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here, and I'm doing this to kind of demonstrate. Right? When you look at these fonts, I'm gonna get my little highlighter going here. So the serif fonts and sans serif fonts are two generally most used categories of fonts on screens. You will notice that the default font for a browser is Times New Roman or Times Roman. It depends on what platform you're on and what they call it, but it's basically Times Roman. And Times Roman is considered a serif font. Serif means decorated font. Okay, so where's the decoration on this, you might ask? If you look really, really closely at the end of the T, there's a little thing that hangs down. And at the bottom of the T, it's got like a little foot or a platform. And if I zoom in really close, I notice the W's got those, and the R has those, and the M's got a little like flag on it, and the G's got a little like triangle at the end of it. Those are called serifs. And there's a bunch of serif fonts out there. Times Roman is not the only one. You'll see right next to it, Georgia, that's a really common one, or Times, which we tend to see on a Mac platform. They're all kind of the same, but they're not exactly, right? If we don't declare it, Times Roman is the default, or whatever your browser does is default. Interesting. Sans serif, conversely, where we have like Arial and Helvetica and Verdana and Geneva. And I say Helvetica because that's really popular on Mac platforms and in printing, by the way. But if you look really closely at those are fonts without decorations at the end. All right, so now you might ask, why the heck did they ever put decorations on the end of fonts? Well, in the old days, they did it because when you printed, they thought it made it look better and easier to read. You might argue one way or the other. I still know people that prefer a serif font over a sans serif font, but I think many of us like the modern sans serif. Ralph?
I was raising my hand of, yes, I like serif better.
Okay, well, there you go. There's one person voting for serif. What I would encourage you to do, though, right, is if you're going to choose a serif font, choose one other than Times Roman, because it tends to give your page the look of an amateur. It's like, oh, this person's using Times Roman. He doesn't even know how to change his font. That's what a lot of people think. Now,
Really?
well, I do think, like, if you are going to do that, like, you use serif fonts, Georgia is a great font. And there's a few others that fit into that category. When they just go on, they just look nicer on the screen. And try it for yourself and you'll see what I mean. You know, I tend to like the sans serifs more, but there's no right or wrong here. And there's many that fit into both categories, but those are the two most popular categories. The third category of fonts is what we call monospace. And these are the real common ones used are Courier and Lucida, right? And both of those are also what we call terminal fonts. And when you are in your coding engine, so all coding tools, Visual Studio Code, Notepad++, you name it, whatever tool you're using, when you're looking at fonts inside this environment, these are all monospace fonts. And what that technically means is that every letter occupies the same amount of space horizontally, regardless of what letter it is. So the letter I, which is a narrow letter, occupies the same amount of space as the letter M, which is a wide letter. Where in a sans serif or serif font, those are proportional fonts, meaning an I will take only as much space as it needs. W will be wider than the I. That's kind of interesting as a difference. Monospace, we usually don't put on the screen unless you're going for a typewriter look or unless you want your text on the page to look like code. But code is always in monospace fonts, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing too. Keon, question?
So like, can I like download a custom font off the internet?
You can, right? But here's what I'm going to say. Yes, the question was, can I download a different font off the internet? All right, so if you're talking about for your operating system, yes, you can. There's free font repositories. You can download them, add them to Windows, add them to the Mac OS. Generally, I'm finding these days that I don't need to do that, where in the old days I used to keep font libraries. If you're talking about adding it to a web page, though, in the old days you could do that, right? So, and it's still possible. You can download the font. You can go to like Font Squirrel or Google Fonts, download the font, put it in your folder, connect to it in your folder, and then put it on your web page. The smarter way to do it these days, though, is you add a snippet of JavaScript. We're not ready for that yet, by the way, into your code, and then link directly to the font library online. Google Fonts being a really good example. So I could, for example, if I was doing a Halloween page, find like a creepy Halloween font on Google Fonts, drop in my JavaScript, drop in the right stuff on the CSS, and I can get this creepy looking Halloween font. That's totally possible. If you're so inclined and want to try it, go for it, but I'm not going to demonstrate that technique generally in this class. I consider it an advanced skill. We need to learn to do the basics first. Once you think you got the basics or you think you can do the advanced thing, it's really pretty easy to do. Just go to Google Fonts. There's probably a gazillion videos on it too, you know. I know that in your later classes, when we start to do advanced CSS stuff, this is one of those things that you might want to add. So if you want to revisit it as a topic, like a few weeks down the road, Keon, like you want to do a Halloween font or whatever, just hit me up and I'll show you how to do it pretty quick, but I don't want to waste the time on it now. Yeah, you should. And what Keon's saying is we'll come to office hours and I can show them how to do that. You know, that's a good format for it. All right. The other two categories, we have cursive fonts that are supposed to look sort of like handwriting. And then we have what we call fantasy fonts, which are kind of like everything else that's kind of weird, you know? Couple suggestions on those. If you are doing a serious professional website, you will typically want to avoid the bottom three font types for serious content. If you went to a website and they did like serious news and they did it all in Comic Sans, it doesn't look professional, folks. And by the way, if you do that in your emails and stuff, it doesn't look professional. You know, that's kind of the general professional analysis. I could maybe see a script font here and there, but once again, generally speaking, not considered professional. Not that you can't do it, but usually if you're using a cursive or a fantasy font, by the way, you have very specific reasons for why. And like the Halloween example is one of them. Like you want to get the word creepy on the page and have it look like it's dripping blood or something. There are fonts out there like that, and it's doable. But if you're trying to sell a product or provide business information, probably not the best idea, right? You know your audience, then choose the font. All right, so what we're going to do now is we are going to start applying font families, but then what I want you to notice here on the slide that they're doing that's kind of weird is, hold on a second, they're not declaring one font, they're declaring three. In fact, they're declaring two in a category. And so I want to talk about that really quickly before I apply this and why it exists. So it is possible to just declare one singular font and just use that. So like you're typing a document, I chose Verdana and I'm going to run with it. Or I chose Geneva and I'm going to run with it. In the web, though, what I can't unfortunately count on as a person that's creating the content is what operating system the user is using, what kind of device they're using, how old that operating system is, which browser they're using, are they speaking a different language, do they have like mods and plugins in their, you know, it goes on and on and on. There's all these things you can't control as the designer. So what we do, generally speaking, is we declare your preferred font first. So that would be Arial in this case. My backup font, Verdana. And then, okay, if you don't have either one of those, give me whatever you have for sans serif. Generally speaking, all the ones that you see on the screen here should be available on every system, by the way. But not necessarily as a rule, right? You might go over to a Mac and you might put in Arial and it might do it or it might not. So the old school that we used to look at this is PC font first, Mac font second, general font category third. And you can actually expand the list if you want. Each subsequent one is the backup to the previous. And if you really, really want to be specific, you just choose one. And then if it doesn't work, then you're kind of like hoping the page loads correctly, right? But this is the general approach. This is the approach that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this now. And I'm going to kind of do like what the author did. And I think for my paragraphs, that's appropriate. I'm going to say font family, and I'm going to say Arial. And you'll notice, this is kind of neat. Visual Studio Code suggesting, I'm gonna go with the suggestion, by the way, because I think this is a better selection than Verdana in the middle. Because Arial is a PC font for sure. It's on every Windows computer. Helvetica is on every Macintosh computer, right? And those are the two most popular sans serif fonts. There's actually a very cool documentary about the Helvetica font. If you guys want to watch it, it's kind of geeky, but whatever, watch it. And then the category. All right, let's save this. Let's go back and look. So this is kind of cool. When you see it in action, now watch all the stuff on the page as I refresh. And notice how all the paragraphs, interesting, some stuff changed and some stuff didn't. Well, the paragraphs all changed. Even the paragraph that has its own inline style changed because it's still a paragraph. So the block quote didn't change. That stayed the way it was. Maybe that's good. The divs didn't change. The ULs, OLs didn't change. My DL didn't change, but everything else did. My titles didn't change either. My headings are still the same. So let's experiment with those a little bit. So I'm going to come down here, and maybe for the H1, I want to have a very particular font. So maybe I'll say font family, and I'm going to do Verdana, and you see what it suggests. I'm just going to go with a suggestion, real frankly. Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, sans serif, right? Since it's auto-suggesting, it's suggesting it for a reason. I'm going with it. Okay, so that's going to be a different font than what I have on my page, right? So the font up here is going to be different than the font here. That's the point. Watch the refresh, right? And you see how that's got a different kind of look to it. Whether this is good or bad, I'm not picking or choosing here, but it is what it is, right? Don't like it, try something else. Don't like the size, change it. Don't like the color, change it, right? I mean, you guys have edited enough documents at this point, I'm hoping, where you know that kind of routine, and it does become pretty subjective. I do notice that the H2 is different, and maybe that H2 could take the same font family, so I could just drop in an H2 here, and then I can just grab that and just paste it in, right, and save it. Let's go back, watch the H2 now, refresh, and there you go. Is that better? I really don't know. You tell me. I think it's a little easier to read, for whatever that's worth, but that's me. You may disagree. All right. The other one I might do, just to demonstrate like a kind of silly, is this a cursive font, I think? But we could do a font family on the block quote and make that comic. See how it doesn't autofill that one? Because it knows it's bad. Right? And because Comic Sans, I think, is a two-word one, you have to put it inside of quotes. And you know what? I'm not even going to give it a backup style. I just want to show you. Let's see if this works, first of all. Refresh. No, that didn't even work. Did I misspell it? I actually have to look at a reference here. Oh, Comic Sans MS. You guys catch that in a capital C? All right. Comic Sans MS. Microsoft, by the way. All right. Let's see what that looks like. Did it work? Oh, there you go. Does that look great? It's kind of okay for a block quote because it kind of looks like it's like somebody's words. You know, that's the only reason I'm applying it. But I'm just trying to show you all three types of fonts. And then, you know, if you want to see what it looks like on a div, right? Let's do it on a div. And then maybe we can use a serif font here. And let's go with, oh gosh, let's go with Georgia. Georgia's a good font. And then Times Roman becomes the backup. So Control S to save, back to the browser, watch I think all these divs right here, refresh, and see how that's a little bit different font. Okay, maybe it's functionally not all that much different. This link here is still seemingly a regular one. This is certainly Times Roman. I do think this one is a little prettier, you know, whatever. It's a matter of experimentation, right? There are websites that show you examples of all the different types of fonts for web. And then there's also the capability these days of tapping in. Once again, like Keon was asking, you can go to like the Google font repository is a great one, and you can link up to any font you want. I wouldn't worry super lot about fonts to begin with. Just make sure people can read it, you know, is a really big portion of it. All right, so that's the font family. And, you know, the other kind of thing they're kind of pushing us towards now is as we get towards these slides towards the end, is you'll notice that we've been building up all these styles now in the embedded section at the top of the document, and the authors got their own examples, and you could follow the author's examples. So for example, I mean, you can see how they're setting up like this is an H1, this is an H2, and it kind of not only is a heading, but also sort of a divider, right? I mean, it kind of help separate your page content. Your menu is what it is for right now, and then, you know, all your other stuff is styled, and the UL was made bold. And so there's all these different little properties that we can mess with. So I want to just show you really quickly some of those we kind of skipped over. So we did font style, font size. Oh no, we did size and family, but not style and weight. So I want to do a little bit of that. All right, let's take our UL and OL, both of those, and I'm going to show you a little trick on those. So here in the styles, I'm going to take my OL, then I'm going to do a comma and say UL, which means I'm applying it to two different tags now. And I do want to switch font family. So maybe we could copy the div font family, might be a nice one to copy. And then I'm going to say font style. And typically when we're applying this, by the way, and I don't know if you noticed the drop-down list, so you can say italic and normal. Okay, why would I put normal in? Oblique, which is basically italic or whatever, and then there's these other things. But italic is really the one that we use this for. And then you could say to yourself, well, couldn't we just do that with an italic tag? Yes, you could, right? But this is controlled through CSS, which means I don't have to edit the HTML document. I just declare it in the CSS document. So it's a better way to do it. So we're changing two things here. We're changing the font and the style on these two little segments here. So watch. So there they are, new fonts and italic. So that's a style demonstration. The last one is a weight. So with the block quote, I'm going to do a font weight, which implies how bold we are. And I like the fact that this tool brings up this thing. So you can just say bold, right? And by the way, a normal font weight, if you didn't know this, is 400. Bolder, I think, is either 600 or 700, and then bolder goes, I don't know, it scales basically. I think this is normal, bold, and bolder. 800 is bolder. And then you can also scale it down. So you can declare the number to determine your level of bold, or you can just say bold. I'm just going to say bold, right, and save it. You know, watch the block quote in the middle. It's already blue in Comic Sans, but watch it and see how it got bolder. May or may not be helpful for you, but just a demo of how it operates. And I'm assuming you guys are all good at this point. I think I got one thing in the chat. All right, is there any way to change links from being blue text? Yes, but we're just not there in the lecture material yet. But we're getting there, and I will show you how to do that.
Mine's still being zoomed in.
Yours is still being zoomed in?
Yeah, I don't know how to change it.
What is zoomed in on?
What-
The whole website zoomed in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So if you're like All right, so Keon, maybe this is the right answer for you, but if you're on your page and you're zoomed in, if you want to reset your zoom for the page, you can come up here to the toolbar in Chrome and just change your zoom level. That would be one way. So you click on this and then your zoom level. The other way is you hold down your control key and then you hit plus or minus. So this is plus, this is minus. But if ultimately you want to reset it back to normal, Control 0 resets it back to normal. Try that. There you go. Is that right? You don't want it zoomed in?
No, I want it like zoomed out, like see it.
Oh, well, then you just hold down Control and you can scroll out with your mouse. You know, you got to keep in mind, if you want it zoomed out, then you might want to consider maybe how you're putting stuff on the page to see all of it. You know what I mean? Because sometimes it might not fit, but that's the general approach. But Control 0 resets your zoom. We will learn later on that there's a way that you can preset the zoom of a page to 100% so that people don't come into it zoomed in. That's a whole thing too, by the way. All right, trying to remember where we left off here. So we were looking at all this embedded stuff on the page, and this is what the author had done up until that point. Now, there's a few more of these that they had in the table above that I'm going to start demonstrating as well. So I'm going to start hitting these one at a time so you can see what the effect is, right? First one is line height. I think a really good place to place that style might be on that block quote. So inside of block quote, I'm going to say line height. And what the author is suggesting is that you go to 200% of normal. So what is the line height? I'm saving this, by the way. Go back to the web page, and I'm looking to affect this block quote, right? So right now, the height of the line, meaning the bottom of the letter all the way to the top to where the next line begins above it, is a certain height, right? I can hotwire that and change it. So in this case, I doubled it. So watch what happens as I refresh and see how the words spread apart, right? It's almost the equivalent of double spacing. Now, why do you do that on a screen? Here's a real simple answer. Sometimes when there's a lot of words on the screen and the words are small, it's really easy to lose your place. So adding line height makes it more comfortable. Why do teachers ask you to double space your papers? Well, I'll tell you why. In the old days, that's so they could write with red ink in between the lines, right? But these days, they also realize that, okay, maybe double's a little much. 1.5 might be good. So if you don't like 200%, you could switch it to 150%. That might be a more reasonable number. And then take a look at the result, right? Refresh, a little closer, but a little farther apart too. So you can find where you think looks comfortable. That's line height, right? That's a pretty useful one in my mind. Another one is text alignment. Okay, this is kind of an important one because by default, when we put stuff on the page in the English language, we read from left to right, correct? And then when we read from left to right, what happens is our eye tends to look at the left to start a paragraph, but sometimes, that's great for a paragraph, but it's not good for the title of a page. I might suggest that my H1 up at the top actually is text-align center. So maybe my logo for my website would look better in the middle than off to the side. Let's save it and take a look. So here's the refresh. Watch where it says Ty's guitar gear and how it moved to the center. And you probably guessed it already. If I wanted to make it go all the way to the right, I could also say right. I could save that, refresh, and there it is on the right. That's a hideous thing, but there it is, right? You have to recognize when stuff doesn't look good, so I kind of pointed out, right? I think center was okay-ish, right? I'm not really sure I would make that design choice, but there is another option here that we often don't talk about, and that is justify. And justify is kind of a weird one. I don't know how well it's going to work on this. We'll see. Yeah, basically what Justify does is it makes sure that you fill up the whole line. Now, I don't have enough words to put in here to fill up the whole line, but like you see how these paragraphs, like one paragraph is a little longer than the other. Justify would make it so that all your paragraphs are the same by increasing the amount of space in between the words inside the paragraph. So that would probably work better on a paragraph. So let me go back to center on this one, and then let's do, for all paragraphs, let's do Justify and see what that looks like. So text dash align Justify. And I'm typically not a fan of using this at all, but I want to show you how it works. So watch these paragraphs and notice like how one ends here, one ends there. This one's a little farther over and that one's in a little bit. And then I do the refresh and see how they're all lined up. And the way they accomplish this is by changing the spacing in between words. This happens in regular documents too, and I'm always really cautious about it because it's not necessarily a good look. I am going to remove this style, by the way. But you had your demo. All right. You guys all good so far? Because these are kind of moving a little bit faster. Another one that's helpful is text indent. Okay, so check it out. If I'm like writing a regular English paragraph, right? And right now my website is what we call block style. Every new paragraph starts at the margin, then there's this blank space, and then more text or paragraphs. But in the traditional way of typing a paragraph, you usually indent like 5 spaces or a certain amount of distance. And what I think will look maybe good here, and this is very subjective, mind you, because you don't have to do this, but you could text dash indent, and then you declare like an amount, like I'm going to go like 20 pixels or points. Now I'm doing pixels because I'm comfortable with that, but you might choose a different format. So I'm just going to use pixels for now. And then what you'll see as I refresh is how the first line of the paragraph is pushed over 20 pixels, because that's kind of how we were taught when we were kids. You do a new paragraph and you indent. And then you go to business school and they're like, no, just do block style and go all the way to the end. You know, whatever you think looks good, but there's how you do it. Notice it doesn't affect the other lines, just the first line. That's not a bad look. I'll leave it. Not a big deal. That's indent. Then there's decoration. All right. This one modifies the appearance of text with an underline, overline, or line through, right? Now, most of the time we do see underlines automatically on web pages on our links. But I'm going to tell you, I hate that on a web page. Sometimes it's useful, I think, right? Like you look here, and it's helpful to know that this is a link. But up here on my menu, when I'm trying to make my menu look cool, this doesn't look cool. So I might want to get rid of the underlines on my menu. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to add a style that affects the A tag or the anchor tag, which are all the links. And I'm going to just simply say text decoration none, which means get rid of whatever lines are going through this, either strike throughs, underlines, overlines, whatever. The underline is the most typical one, and this is how you get rid of it. So watch now the links up here. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little bit more clearly as I refresh how the underlines go away. There's still links though, right? They're still linkable. Now, normally I don't usually hotwire code and give you guys stuff in advance of when you should be there, but somebody said, hey, is there a way to change the link color? Well, since we're addressing the anchor tag, I could make the color of the anchor tag a different color. So I could just say that all my links will be, you know, pick a color, you know. Now, blue is the default, you know, but what if I decided, okay, I'm gonna go with the crimson. All my links are crimson. All right, let's save that and take a look. I'm not saying that this is good, but I'm showing you that it works. All my links are red. They're still links. I'm going to throw in one little other tidbit, and you guys will thank me for this because it makes it feel like it's cool, right? I'm going to give you what we call a pseudo selector, where I can add this little thing to it, which responds to me hovering over my links, and then I can change the color of the link when I hover to maybe blue. So you notice how I did that? That's hover. They have to touch, so that means it addresses the hover state of the mouse over the link. So Control S to save, and then I'm going to take a moment here and refresh. Okay, no visual change, but when I move my mouse over, very cool, folks. It's almost starting to behave and look like a menu, right? But you see, now I have a hover effect. It's crimson when it's just sitting there. The underline is gone, and when I hover, that's kind of cool, right? And then I can click on it and go. All right, any questions on those? You guys good? All right, I'm going to keep rolling here. I'm trying to cover as many of these tags as I can in the time that we have left. All right, another one that they have is one called text transform, and this one actually allows us to change something that is lowercase into uppercase, or uppercase into lowercase, or lowercase into title case. There's all these different things. I'm just going to demonstrate like maybe one or two of those, and I'll probably do it like on the H2. So I'll do text dash transform. Notice what we can do here. Capitalize would be one, uppercase, lowercase are the other ones. So let's capitalize first, and we'll save. And then let's look at the page as it is first. So I'm going to be working on this. Capitalize will take each word in the string and change the first letter of it to a capital. So watch. Right? That's without me changing the HTML. That's kind of cool, right? Or if I wanted to, on the title, which is the H1, right? I could do text dash transform uppercase, save. Now watch my title bar here at the top. It's going to be uppercase letters, and I didn't change the code. So why this is useful is somebody might hand you copy, you copy and paste it right into your HTML, and then you're like, I don't like the way it looks, let's make it uppercase. I don't have to go change code. Okay. So that's text transform. Then we have letter spacing. That's a little weird. I'll apply that on the title here because I think it's the easiest place to see it. And that's actually where we increase the spacing in between each letter. Okay, why would you do that? Oh, I don't know. You know, to create a look, basically. And normally we will style this with M's, but you'll notice they have a whole bunch of different things in there. Sometimes it's calculated, sometimes it's dynamic, but normally I would do like 1.1 M is a good one, right? So watch what happens here. So watch the letters up top here and watch the refresh. Okay, this is 110% of the normal width of a letter in between each letter is what that really means, right? Is that cool? Well, here's the one cool part about it. It did fill the top, right? Will that look as cool when I make my screen smaller? Maybe not. I don't know. Judge for yourself and pick, basically. But yeah, I'm trying to move this window here. This is what happens when you're multi-screening and you make something too big. And all your zoom toolbars are in the way. There we are, back to normal. So play with that letter spacing one. Use very, very, very small values typically. What would probably be a better value here would be like 0.25 or something. So watch this one. You tell me if that's a little better. That's a little better, right? It's a little spread apart, not too spread apart. So try to be tasteful, you know, with your choices, styling. Word spacing is also a thing. Word spacing works basically the same way, but it just controls the spaces between words. So let's look at maybe guitars, pedals, amps, and other cool gear. So my H2. So on my H2, I might do word spacing, and we could, let's do a really small value again. Let's go 0.89 M, save it, refresh, watch. Okay. You know, it's okay-ish, you know. Maybe it's a little wide, but whatever. I'm gonna leave it. And then finally, we have this weird thing. And you know, in order to really demonstrate this one, I want to do it on the H1. I kind of have to change how I'm doing the H1 a little bit. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my color here to a dark color, like a really, really dark red. All right, so I switched my font to a dark red, and then I'm going to switch my background to something like super, super light. And I'm doing this on purpose, by the way, so I can demonstrate the effect of text shadow. So I'm going to save this change. Let's go take a look really quick. Here's the refresh, right? Still have a background, still have the letters, but now it's black letters on white text. Now what text shadow does, and this one's a lot trickier to use, I would really call this a more advanced skill, but I'm going to demonstrate a real primitive usage of it. A text shadow will allow you to cast a shadow behind your font to make it look like it's popping out of the screen, right? To create basically an effect. I'm going to give you some code here. You can just copy it if you wish, but I would once again say that this is maybe a little bit more of an advanced CSS skill. The way that we do text shadow is we have a horizontal offset, a vertical offset, a diffusion amount, and a color, and then normally I use black because what color is a shadow, you know? Well, it's dark, right, typically, right? But you could put really any color here, so you could put like fuchsia here, but beware of horrible effects when you do that. So as I save this and go back, now watch the letters here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit to show you a little more clearly what's happening. Here's the refresh. Now, this is a little rough, and here's why it's rough. The text is black and the shadow is black. But you can see the shadow, right? What if, okay, let's change the font color then from black to maybe, let's get it in the, I don't know, dark purple range to give it a little differentiation. So there it is. We're saving it. Let's go back, let's refresh. And now, I don't know if you saw the difference there. It's still, it's a little more visible. And actually, really, I should go even lighter on that purple, like maybe move it back up this way a little bit. Save, refresh. I think it's refreshing, right? Did it? I'm not sure that that's saved. Oh, you know what I'm doing is I'm changing the paragraph. I want to be changing this. Oh, okay. Mishap 45 for the day. All right, here's the refresh. So lighter purple, but now you can see that background. If you think that shadow is too dark, you can simply switch that black to a shade of gray. So just come down on the edge here a little bit, save. Here's the refresh, and that might look a little better. Now, the 5 pixel offset means 5 pixels to the left, 5 pixels towards the bottom, and then there's a diffusion of 5 pixels where the shadow kind of spreads out. You can play with those values. So for example, I could do a -5 and a -5 on the first two, and then that, watch what this does, moves the shadow up to the other opposite corner. Or a great trick that a lot of operating system developers do, and I don't know if you guys ever notice this when you're on a Windows or a Mac OS, whatever windows they put up on the screen all have a drop shadow, but they usually have a bigger diffusion. So here's an example of that technique where the shadow is evenly spread in the background behind the letter. This is not a good example of it, but it kind of makes it look like it's popping out of the screen more. I think typically for text, the thing I did first, which is 555, basically is a workable, good basic one with like a dark gray pattern. So here's the refresh like that. And those shadowing techniques, by the way, work on other objects. They just have different names. So there's like box shadow, border shadow, yada, yada, yada. Right? But this is it for text. So there it is. I mean, and if you kind of look at this, you know, it might not be the best shadow color. Like I'm still thinking I might go like even lighter. So saving, refreshing. Okay, that's a little more palatable to me for whatever reason. And I think it's starting to actually look kind of good. And you can see the dimensionality of it. That's what this is about. So shadow makes it look like, you know, makes it look like something, you know, that's a polite way to say it. Like somebody took the time to put it into Photoshop and clean it up a little bit, but really we're doing it in CSS. All right, so those are all those basic styles. Now, another thing, and I'm looking at the clock here, and I'm looking that we really don't have a lot of slides left, so I'm going to try to cover this. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Class ends at 3:40, but I'm going to push through and keep recording. You guys can stay in the session, stay in the room if you want. If you guys want to leave, you're welcome to leave also, but we got 7 more minutes. I don't realistically think I can finish it in 7, but I'm trying, all right? But I do want to finish the chapter. And then what I'm going to do in the aftermath of it, if you guys are interested, is I'm going to take my work and upload it to Prometheus, and then it will be available for y'all to look at as well. So if you miss the examples because I'm going too fast, probably the case, you'll be able to find it on my solutions page on Prometheus. All right, so we covered all those, but now we start to think about this concept of like, well, I can apply styles to a certain tag. So if I have a paragraph or a H1, that's cool, I can do that. Okay, fantastic. Now, what if I have something that is more unique than that, or something that maybe shares, that isn't a paragraph, but shares properties of the paragraph, and I want to kind of like put them all into the same kind of thing. So there's a couple different ways that we can start to narrow down content in HTML so that we're pointing to very specific items on the screen in a few different ways. The first way is the HTML tag. That's the HTML element selector. That's on this list. Another way is the class selector. A class selector, by the way, applies to many items on one page, right? The ID, conversely, IDs are unique to one item on the page, right? So I'm not going to keep typing, but yeah, I think you get the point. And then we have this descendant selector, of which that also becomes a little bit deeper of a study. We will look at descendant selectors, but not in this chapter. Okay, so let's start first with the class. So I'm going to jump back over here, and first thing we have to do when doing a class selector is basically adjust our HTML code to apply a class identifier to objects in the screen. So for example, I might decide that for my nav, I might have a class, or for my paragraphs, I might have a class, but I'm trying to think of something more generic. Maybe my lists here can have a class, and you know what? I'm going to say class equals, and I'm going to say lists, okay? And then I'm going to take that same class and apply it to the ordered list as well. Now what happens is, what we're really doing here is we're giving it a name that we can refer to via CSS and JavaScript, by the way, to control that stuff more in ways. So like, given the fact that a UL and an OL are two different tags, it's unlikely that I would group them in styling. I have already done that. But by giving it a class, I can now refer to the class of list and then apply stuff universally to those objects. So here's how I would do that. I would scroll up to the top here, And then to identify a class selector, we start with a period and then the name of a class. So in this case, list. So notice dot list, that means class list, right? And then maybe the color on those is, let's pick some sort of goofy color here. I'm just going to pick it from the list. I'm going to go with dark magenta is my selection, right? Partially because it's very evident. And you know what? Let's also do font weight bold to make it stand out even more, make it even more hideous than it would be just with being magenta. So here it is. Control save. Back over to the page. We'll scroll down to where the lists are, and I'm going to refresh. Okay, see how they got bolder, purple? Both of those have the same class structure. Right. We'll work with that a lot more, but I just want to demonstrate the initial property of it. The other one that we use is the ID, and the ID takes an object and makes it unique by putting in a similar thing, but instead of saying class, we say ID. So for example, I'm trying to think of something here that would be useful to put an ID on. Maybe this particular paragraph, or you can tell I'm like searching for which one. Okay, these divs are really a good idea. So for example, I can create an ID and call it whatever. That's one of my standard, can't think of things to do. So I'm just calling this one whatever. And so as an ID now, if I want to address that in styles, I do that with a pound sign. So I say pound sign, whatever, curly brackets, and now I want to say, let's just make the font size like uber big. Let's make it like 250% of normal, and heck, let's make the color something weird too, like aquamarine. Right. Control S to save. Watch your browser. We're looking at this thing right here. Here's your refresh. And isn't that cool? And the answer is definitely no. Aquamarine is a harmful color in this context, but it does attribute it directly to this object. IDs are really important. And the one thing I will tell you about IDs is they are reserved to only one object per page. So once I use an ID on one object, I cannot use it on another, where class declarations can be used on anything and everything, right? There's a whole school of thought about this, but generally speaking, IDs are unique, classes can be repeated. Can something have both a class and an ID? And the answer is yes, by the way. And in fact, it can be kind of a styling strategy when it comes right down to it. All right, so here's an example of the ID. We just did that with the pound sign, right? Here's an example of a class, right, with a dot. And then they show what we call the descendant selector, and I do call this a more advanced skill, but this is when we start placing objects inside of others. So if I create a div and then put a paragraph inside the div, I can tunnel down and just style the paragraph, particularly by putting a space in between them. So I'm saying, go to the thing named content. Inside that thing, there's a paragraph, and give it this style. I'm going to call that a more advanced skill. It's not that it's really hard to demonstrate, I guess, but that is typically a more advanced skill. But this is what they kind of prefer that you do, rather than going into that paragraph and giving it a specific ID, is to tunnel down using a descendant selector. And really what it means is this thing is inside of that thing. All right. One other little tag that we're going to learn here is the span element. And you guys, I am looking at the clock here, and I'm just, I could be going for quite a while, and I think that maybe it's wise that I try to cap it. But if you guys need to go, and I'm just saying it here in the recording, you guys are free to go. The class time is formally done. But I have this like thought that I should try to get this recording finished at least for y'all. All right, so if you guys need to go, please go. Right, the span element's kind of an interesting one. We just put a ID on a div, and we learned last week that a div is a generic block level element. A span, conversely, is a generic inline element for HTML that look sort of like this when we're working with them. So for example, if I had a need, like in the middle of text, to take a few words and do something different to them stylistically right in the middle of a block of text, like in the middle of a paragraph, like this example, you could add the span tag around that text, give it a class name or an ID, either one, doesn't matter. And then you can style that separately. I'm going to do that super fast here. So back over in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to find my second paragraph here, and around this word guitar, I'm going to add a span tag. I'm going to give it a class of cool, for lack of a better thought there. And then I'm going to move the closing span tag, cut it and paste it after the word guitar. Okay, so that's the HTML setup. Up at the top, I'm going to add a class declaration. So what was that called? Cool, right? And then inside here, maybe I'll just make it, I'll just do font dash size 145% of normal, saving it back over to the page. And I think it's this word right here. So watch. Oh, maybe not. Refresh. Did I save? I did. Dot cool. Oh, see, I made a mistake down here. Class equals cool. There's always a reason why your code fails. Here we go. There you go. So that's an example. All right, so moving along, we're getting there, folks. Now comes the grand demonstration of moving everything to an external style sheet. This should go fairly quickly here. So on my main code page, I've gone to the trouble of creating all these styles. And you see how my document's like getting really long now with styles. What I'm going to do inside my folder is I'm going to create a new file. So I'm going to say File, New File, and I'm going to name it. And I'm going to choose the name styles.css. And it should put it in the same folder, and I'm making sure it does. And yes, we're going to create it in the same folder. Now I'm going to go back to my index document, and I'm going to go into the style tag, and I'm going to highlight all the styles that I've created so far, but not the style tags, right? Opening and closing style tags are staying in place, but I'm grabbing all the CSS. I'm doing a Control X to cut. Now I'm moving over to the style sheet and pasting. And you see how it all pasted in beautifully. Control S to save. And now back over to the index file where I now have an empty style tag. I am, however, going to do what they say in the slideshow here, which is I'm going to link it to my style sheet. Why do we do this? Because now I can use the same styles on every page, all controlled by one CSS file. And then you use this link element to do the linking. All right, so watch how this goes. This goes pretty quick. So you do a link tag. And then what's the other little thing? Oh yeah, the relationship is style sheet. So you type style sheet here, and this is, I'm going to call this optional, by the way. And then you have the href, and then the name of your file. So it has to be exactly the right name. And then you want to close your tag. I want you to notice this is another one of those self-closing tags. But what I've done here now is I've linked my HTML page to the style sheet I just created, made sure I saved both of them. And then when I go back to the browser and refresh, right, here's the refresh, everything is still working. When I right click and view source, I will see that the styles are gone from here. And then notice how there's a link to the style sheet that you can click on and see the styles. Pretty nifty. All right. I'm going to keep pressing along here. We're almost done. So ultimately, what I'd like you to do is do that. So you might choose to do that with your pages immediately. I think the author makes you ultimately do that with the case study. So it's good to get practice on that. And that pretty much wraps up the chapter. We are going to talk about this centering stuff thing really quickly, and I'm going to show you a really quick way to do this since it's on the page. So I'm going to go to my index page, and just inside the body tag, I'm going to create a div. I'm going to call it, you can call it whatever you want, but I'm going to give it an ID. And normally most of us web designers call it a wrapper or a container. I'm going to go with the author's example for right now and call it a container. And then this is going to create the closing div right here, but that is not where I want it. I'm going to cut this, and then I'm going to move that all the way to the bottom of the page, just inside the closing body tag right here. And then I do this, and I haven't talked about commenting yet, but like closes container. I do that often, so I know which div goes with which div, by the way. Now that I've done the structural change, this will make no impact, by the way, on the actual appearance of the page so far. So here's the page, refresh, right? No impact, reset to 0 zoom. Now I'm going to go to the style sheet, and I'm going to do this right below the body tag here. I'm going to say this was an ID, right? So I'm going to say # container, spelled correctly. And then I'm going to set this width to, I think 80% is the example, and save this. And now I want you to see the effect on the page. So here's my refresh. Now we're 80% width. Okay, great. It narrowed up a little bit, but it's off to the left. Not so great, right? If you want to center that on the page, here's the trick that goes with that. 2 different ways to do it, by the way. Here's my favorite way, which is margin, : 0, auto, right? Which is the same as saying margin left auto and margin right auto. That's the same declaration. 0 also handles the top and the bottom, by the way. And then when you go back to your browser and refresh, now you're in the middle. If you don't like the 80%, you can change it. You can make it, I don't know, 65%. Refresh. And now the page is narrowed up. Add a little background between, and I'm starting to see like how we build a website a little bit, right? So that's kind of the end of all the coding stuff in the chapter. The refresh that I'm going to do on like how it works is whatever your browser does happens automatically. When a style sheet kicks in, then it looks at that to override those styles. Then whatever's added to the top of a page will override those. And if it's attached to a tag, it overrides those. Now, why they do it this way and not the other way? More specific, more control, right? But generally seen as better to put all your styles in an external style sheet and use these other 2 only when needed. I ask you to demonstrate these, and I think the author does too, but generally speaking, you want all your styles in an external style sheet. The other thing you can do is you can go to this URL if you want to validate your CSS code, because it can become invalid. Absolutely. And if it's invalid, it breaks. And I'll just give you a really quick example here. If I take, for example, up here, if I, let's say, forget the closing bracket, here it highlights it red already, and I save this, and then I come back here, I don't know what's going to happen on my page. Notice all the styles broke, right? So be mindful of that. And remember, whenever you're using the validator tools, you start with the top arrow first and work your way down. If you're not sure what they mean, bring it to class next week and I will help you with it. But it looks like this should go back. Apparently I didn't save it. Oh, that's not a curly bracket. There you go. The red was a clear indicator, but I did bring it back. as we move forward now, I'm going to start ramping up this design. You're going to apply all of these same techniques, by the way, folks, to your case study, so you can refer back to this as a reference if you wish. But as I did promise, I do want to add this to Prometheus so you guys can link to it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and bring up FileZilla. I am going to refresh here. So I have the latest version on both sides. And then I do want to navigate to the correct folder. Now I see I have a unit 3 here on this side. I want to be in the same spot. See how I'm in the root on both sides? And since I did all my work here in unit 3, I'm just moving all of that over. And now it's on the server. I still get kind of nerdy and check to make sure it's there. That's me, right? And that zip file certainly doesn't need to be there, so it can be deleted really from both sides. And then let's go to the browser and see if it worked. So now I'm going to type Prometheus. I know my naming convention. It's web prog-fa23 and then unit 3/project. And there's my updated page live on the server. I will be adding a link to this on my solutions page, but I'm going to wait till I get home to do that. And then it will be, this video I think turned out well, so this one will actually get posted. So you guys will see this inside of unit 3 tomorrow, and I'll do a little announcement about it as well. All right, folks, that ends class.